The modern world order didn't collapse with a war. It cracked in a single night. Hours before his arrest, Nicolas Maduro was praising Xi Jinping as an older brother, celebrating decades of partnership, stability, and patience. Then came the image that changed everything. Maduro blindfolded, handcuffed, standing on a U.S. warship, 2 photographs, one system undone. This was not simply a raid on a dictator. And it was not really about Venezuela. It was about how power now works in a world where rules are increasingly optional and speed beats strategy. China has spent decades building influence carefully, methodically, believing that order would ultimately prevail. Donald Trump has just demonstrated how quickly that assumption can be shattered. If you think this story begins and ends in Caracas, you are missing the larger danger unfolding beneath it. Stay with me. Because before we can understand what China risks losing next, we must first understand what it thought it had already secured. What exactly is the problem here? At first glance, this looks like a familiar story. The United States removes a hostile leader, China issues condemnations, markets speculate, diplomats posture. We have seen versions of this before. But that reading is dangerously incomplete. What makes this moment different is not the raid itself. It is what the raid disrupts. For China, Venezuela was never just an ally. It was a test case, proof that Beijing could expand, influence quietly, legally, and patiently without firing a shot or tearing up the global rulebook. Oil for loans, infrastructure for access, long-term presence without confrontation. Trump's move shattered that logic in hours. Suddenly, the assumptions China relied on, that investments would be respected, that sovereignty would be observed, that great powers would at least pretend to follow rules, were called into question. And that forces Beijing into a dilemma it has tried to avoid for decades: how to compete in a world where unpredictability, not patience, sets the tempo. Before we can see how China might respond, we need to understand how this relationship was built and why it mattered so much to Beijing in the first place. To understand why this mattered so deeply, we need to go back well before the raid, well before Trump. At the turn of the century, China was growing at a historic pace and hungry for one thing above all else: energy security. Venezuela, sitting on vast oil reserves but starved of capital, offered a perfect match. What followed was not a dramatic alliance, but a slow transactional partnership. Beijing provided cash, not speeches, not troops, cash. Railways, power plants, infrastructure. In return, oil flowed east. This was China's preferred model. No regime change, no public moralizing, just contracts, loans, and time. From roughly 2000 onward, more than $100 billion moved into Venezuela under this logic. And for years, it worked. Caracas got lifelines, Beijing got fuel. Both sides avoided confrontation with Washington by staying inside the language of development and sovereignty. This was not improvisation. It was strategy, a belief that economic gravity, patiently applied, would eventually reshape global influence, especially across the global south. And that belief held until the night the rules stopped mattering. Because once that framework collapses, every investment looks different. The crisis did not unfold gradually. It detonated. In a single operation, ordered under Donald Trump, the United States did something China had long assumed Washington would avoid. It acted unilaterally against a sitting government in the heart of South America. No coalition, no prolonged diplomacy, just force, speed, and a message delivered in images rather than communiques. For Beijing, the shock was not moral, it was structural. Hours earlier, Nicolas Maduro was still the guarantor of Chinese contracts, loans, and oil shipments. By morning, that assumption was worthless. Investments that had been protected by sovereignty now floated in legal and political limbo. Then came the second signal. On American television, Marco Rubio drew a bright line. The Western Hemisphere would not be a base for rivals of the United States. It was a warning without subtlety, and China heard it clearly. If you are Beijing, this is the moment you stop asking what happened in Venezuela and start asking where this logic ends. Stay with me. Because this crisis was not about one country falling. It was about a system being exposed, and once exposed, it cannot simply be patched back together. What this moment reveals is a deeper mechanism at work one China has long understood, but hoped it could avoid confronting directly. Beijing's global strategy is built on a simple assumption that economic presence creates political insulation. Invest enough, lend patiently, become indispensable, and eventually disruption becomes too costly for others to attempt. In Venezuela, that logic looked solid. Chinese firms like China, National Petroleum Corporation, and Sinopec embedded themselves deeply. Loans were repaid not in cash, but in oil. Risk was spread over decades. Exposure felt manageable. But Trump's raid exposed the flaw. Economic gravity only works when the rules protecting it remain intact. The moment power overrides contracts, patience becomes vulnerability. Sovereignty, once the shield for Chinese investments, suddenly becomes conditional, interpreted, enforced, or ignored by whoever moves fastest. This is why Beijing's reaction has been so careful. Loud condemnation, yes, but no escalation, no retaliation. Because responding emotionally would mean admitting that its entire model is now subject to someone else's tempo. And that is the real danger. When chaos replaces predictability, long-term strategies lose their advantage. The player who thrives is not the one who plans best, but the one willing to disrupt first. That realization is what pushes this crisis into its next, more dangerous phase. Because the system China relies on did not break accidentally. It was tested and found wanting. The second shock came quietly, but it cut deeper. As the images from Venezuela circled the world, Beijing began to confront a harder question. Not whether its current investments were safe, but whether future ones would ever be again. Around 80% of Venezuelan oil flows to China. Yet that supply represents only a sliver of China's total imports. In pure numbers, the risk looked manageable. Strategically, it was anything but. Roughly $10 billion in outstanding loans suddenly sat in uncertainty. Chinese energy assets faced the possibility of being sidelined, pressured, or quietly rewritten under a new political reality shaped far from Beijing. And just as important, potential investors were watching. Not just in Caracas, in Brasilia, in Lima, in Buenos Aires. If partnering with China now carried the risk of attracting unwanted American attention, hesitation would spread fast. Confidence, once lost, rarely returns on schedule. This was the second crisis. Invisible, financial, psychological. No explosions, no arrests, just doubt seeping through boardrooms and ministries alike. And doubt travels faster than oil. Before China could even calculate its losses, it faced something more corrosive. The fear that its model of influence might now repel the very countries it was designed to attract. And that fear would soon land closest to home on people far removed from power. For ordinary people, this is where abstraction becomes reality. If you are a Chinese engineer stationed in Venezuela, this moment is not about geopolitics. It is about whether your project survives the year. If you are a factory worker back home, it is about whether long-term contracts quietly disappear, and with them, job security you never knew depended on events half a world away. And if you are a citizen in the global south watching this unfold, the message lands even harder. You were told that partnerships could be built without choosing sides. That development could be separated from power politics. That stability came from patience. Now you see how fragile that promise is. For China's leadership, this is not just a balance sheet problem. It is a trust problem. Influence is not only money and infrastructure, it is belief. The belief that alignment brings safety, not exposure. If that belief erodes, everything becomes more expensive. Every deal requires more guarantees. Every partnership carries hidden fear. And this is where I want you to pause, because the costs of great power competition are rarely paid by presidents or diplomats. They are paid by workers, communities, and countries caught between forces they do not control. If you care about how global power actually touches real lives, stay with me, because the consequences of this moment do not stop in Venezuela or even in China. What happens next does not stay contained. When a major power redraws the boundaries of acceptable action, the shockwaves travel outward through markets, alliances, and assumptions that once felt settled. For countries across the global south, this raid was not interpreted as an isolated case. It was read as a signal that rules can be bent when interests are large enough, that investments can become liabilities overnight, that neutrality may no longer be neutral. For China, the implications stretch far beyond Latin America. Its claim to be a predictable partner, one that respects sovereignty and rejects unilateral bullying, now competes with a harsher reality. The United States is willing to act first and explain later, especially in regions it considers strategic. This tension reverberates through trade routes, energy markets, and diplomatic choices. It sharpens anxieties in places already balancing between Washington and Beijing. And it feeds a deeper question about the future of global order itself. Is influence earned slowly through integration and trust, or seized quickly through disruption and force? As that question hangs unanswered, every regional dispute begins to look connected. Every crisis feels like a rehearsal for the next one. And nowhere is that sense of rehearsal felt more acutely than in the scenarios now being quietly debated behind closed doors in Beijing. Because once global consequences are in motion, leaders are forced to imagine futures they hope to avoid. What does the future look like from Beijing's perspective? There are three broad paths, and none are comfortable. The first is the optimistic scenario. China absorbs the shock, it protects most of its assets, Venezuela stabilizes under new arrangements. Beijing doubles down on its narrative that patience outlasts disruption, that American volatility eventually alienates partners. In this world, chaos becomes a short-term cost and a long-term recruiting tool for China's vision of order. The second is the muddled middle. Investments survive, but confidence does not fully return. Countries in the global south hedge harder, deals slow, risk premiums rise. China remains influential, but its expansion becomes more expensive, more cautious, more bureaucratic, not a collapse, but a drag on momentum. Then there is the darkest scenario. The precedent hardens. The United States intervenes again openly or indirectly wherever it sees strategic threats. Chinese projects become magnets for pressure. Partners quietly distance themselves. Beijing is forced to choose between confrontation and retreat, abandoning the very patience that defined its rise. Here is the uncomfortable truth. China prefers none of these outcomes. Its system is designed for predictability, for long arcs, for rules, even imperfect ones. But history rarely asks what great powers prefer. It asks what they can adapt to. And adaptation, when driven by fear rather than confidence, reshapes strategy in ways that are hard to reverse. That is why the final lesson of Venezuela is not about oil or loans or even America. It is about what happens when a world built on expectation suddenly starts rewarding risk instead. And that brings us to the final question: what this moment ultimately teaches us about power itself. The lesson of this moment is not hidden. It is uncomfortable, and that is why it matters. Power today is no longer just about resources, alliances, or even ideology. It is about tempo, about who moves first, who is willing to disrupt, who accepts uncertainty as a weapon rather than a risk. China built its rise on patience, on predictability, on the belief that the future rewards those who plan carefully and wait. Trump's Venezuela raid challenged that belief head on, not by argument but by action. And here is the deeper insight I want you to sit with. When chaos starts paying dividends, every system designed for stability begins to wobble. Not just China's, everyone's. This is why Venezuela matters far beyond Caracas. It tells us what kind of world is emerging, one where rules are tested in real time, where power is performed, not negotiated, and where long-term strategy must now survive short-term shock. If you want to understand the next decade of global politics, don't just watch what countries say, watch what they dare to do. And if you want to stay ahead of these shifts, how they connect, how they escalate, and where they lead, make sure you don't miss what comes next. Because this story is not over. It is only changing shape.